When you're writing code, are you doing it right? That's the question that worries a lot of people, and it should probably be at least something that every developer thinks through. Design patterns are best practice concepts that we can implement into our code to make it better in some way. Think of them as guardrails that keep our code safe and help us do it right. In today's video, we're going to look at the fourth entry in the famous SOLID principle. The I stands for Interface Segregation Principle. We're going to dive into what it means, how it should change our programming practices, and how far we should take it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to clear up the confusion and frustration around learning C#, because learning software development shouldn't be so hard. If that sounds like something that would interest you, I think you'd benefit from subscribing to my channel and also joining my mailing list. My mailing list is where you get exclusive content and insider access. You can find a link to join the mailing list in the description below. Also in that description, you'll find a link to my blog post on this topic where I include the download links for the source code at the beginning of this video and also the source code at the end. So let's start the conversation on the Interface Segregation Principle, which we're going to call ISP from now on, by looking at some code. I could do some nifty PowerPoint for you and show you some fun pictures that try and represent the issue, but I find it best just to look at this in a practical manner. Here I have a project that I created in Visual Studio in C#. Now the principles of this video actually apply to any software development language, but since this channel focuses primarily on C#, that's the language we'll use. The code I have here is rather simple. I have a console application that simulates the data structure of a library application. And by library, I mean a place that lends books and other items, not the C# class library project type. So as you can see, we have our program.cs, which doesn't do anything yet. And really it doesn't have to. We may get into a little bit here, but for the most part, this is all about our class library. We have here one interface right now, the iLibrary item. And that has a bunch of properties and a few methods. Then we have 4 different classes that implement this interface. We have the book class with its implementation. We have the audiobook class, the DVD class, and the reference book class as well. Now the problem with this application so far is that it violates ISP. So now that we have some code in front of us, let's talk about ISP. ISP states that a client should not be forced to depend on interfaces they don't use. So let's look at how that plays out. Our interface is iLibrary item. Now the book class implements everything. So it has a library ID, that works, title, author, pages, checkout duration and days, who the borrower is, if there is one, when the borrow date was, and then 3 methods, check it out, check it in, and get due dates, which sounds great. All of these apply to a book. And probably if your library application was old enough or small enough to start with, that's all you really had was books. That's usually the primary thing you think of with libraries is lending books. But they do so much more. So the next item that would come up is audiobooks. Well, an audiobook has a title and author, but pages. An audiobook doesn't have pages. Now you could say, well, the original book had a number of pages. True, that's not this. Okay, this would be tapes or CDs or MP3s or something of that nature. So therefore, that's not really something that we need. And so I set to -1 because we don't want it to reflect an actual value. Then we actually have this additional property called runtime minutes. Yeah, that's kind of important for an audiobook. How long is it? But all the rest of the stuff really applies. Now another implementation would be a reference book. Think of these as the very large dictionaries that you can't check out. Or maybe an encyclopedia. Again, you can't check it out. So, it has all the things of a book, but borrower really doesn't apply. Checkout duration in days, well, you can't have any duration, therefore I'd set it as 0. But that's not really an effective way of doing things. Borrower date doesn't apply. Checkout, check-in, and get due date, I set them all to throw a new not implemented exception because they don't implement those methods. You can't borrow, you can't check out, you can't check in, and you can't get a due date for a book that never leaves the library. So that's where a violation, again, of the interface segregation principle comes into play. We're relying on this interface which says you have to have these 3 methods, but they don't really apply. Neither does this property or this property or this property. So there's a lot of stuff here that doesn't apply to a reference book. Then libraries started allowing DVDs to be borrowed. Well, a DVD doesn't have pages. It does have a list of actors and does have a runtime of minutes. So it gets close, but it's not the same thing because those pages don't reapply and neither does the author. Because you're kind of shoehorning something in to try and put something in the author. You could say the director, but that's not the same thing. A director is not the author. So these 2 properties don't really apply. But we do have a couple of additional properties we want to add that make sense for a DVD. So what we've learned is this interface right here, while it gives us all the different parts that a book needs, it doesn't really apply to the other items. Audiobooks have something different, the DVDs have something radically different, and the reference book is just so different that really half this stuff doesn't apply. And so this would be one monolithic interface, but it's not really going to work well for us. And so what ISP says is break this down into smaller pieces. Now, if you watch my previous video on LSP, the Liskov substitution principle, some of this stuff's going to seem really familiar because we're really doing the same thing with interfaces that we did with classes and inheritance in the last video. We're going to break this down into pieces that everyone can agree on that uses them. We'll kind of make them more modular. So let's start off by cutting down this iLibrary item. What are the things that are really important? And let's move this up here. What are the things that are really important to a library item? Well, a library ID. Everything has a library ID. That's like that unique barcode or unique identifier that says this is the identifier for what this particular item is in the library. Now, we also have title down here, which I'm not sure why it's got moved down, but we can move them around. We have title. That really applies to pretty much everything. We can say title is the title, whether it's the title of a movie, the title of a book, the title of an audiobook, the reference book, even other things would have a title. So we can keep that. Author doesn't apply. So let's go ahead and comment that out for now. Borrow date, well, reference books we're not going to borrow. Therefore, let's get rid of that. The borrower, the checkout duration in days, pages, that's a book thing. The check-in, the checkout, and the get due date, those are all borrow items. So that's one interface now, the iLibrary item, that just has 2 pieces of information. The ID from the library and the title. That's it. Now, let's create some more interfaces that will further define the different pieces and kind of group them together. So let's start by right-click on Demo Library and say Add, New Item, Interface, and let's call this let's start with iBook. So the iBook interface is going to further define a library item. So we'll actually inherit from iLibraryItem. Now the book is going to have, let's go over here and grab it. It'll also have the author information and the pages information. So let's move those together and I'll cut them out of here. I'll paste them in here and we will uncomment them. Okay, so the iBook now has author and pages, as well as what it inherits from iLibraryItem. iLibraryItem has library ID and title. So now we're kind of getting a little more information here about what a book is. Now we also need to have something for all the borrow information. So let's create a interface called iBorrowable. And make it public. I'll come back over to, let's close some of these out. You get so many tabs open, it's just hard to see where everything is. Let's go over here and grab all of these. And we'll cut them out and paste them into iBorrowable and uncomment them. Now we could have iBorrowable inherit from either iLibraryItem or iBook, but that's going to cause some weird conflicts. And the reason why is because what about the reference book? How do we say that we have a reference book and also a regular book which is borrowable? So if iBorrowable inherited from iBook, it'd have both iLibrary items and iBook items, but then you're calling it an iBorrowable. But that would seem to apply to audiobooks and DVDs as well. The problem is, but you also have this iBook stuff, which again gets back to we're implementing things that we don't really need. So I don't think that works to connect the two. And so what I would do is I would actually create a new interface. And I would call this interface iBorrowable book. Which would inherit from iBorrowable, and iBook. And there you go. You don't have to add anything more to it. It's actually kind of an empty interface, but what it does is it joins these two. So now we have an interface called iBorrowable book. And if I go over my book class, and instead of iLibraryItem, I say iBorrowable book, nothing else has to change. The book now implements everything we have in both the iBorrowable and iBook and iLibraryItem, and technically also iBorrowable book, which is just the combination of two. So see how I'm kind of pulling these apart. Instead of having one big gigantic brick, I now have little pieces that I can put together in different ways as they make sense. So now for reference books, I can say instead of iLibraryItem, I can say iBook. Because iBook has just the stuff that applies to a book, but I don't have to implement any of the checkout information associated with borrowing. So now I have just what applies to a reference book. The library ID, the title, the author, and the pages, which is all applies to a book, but it's not a borrowable book. The actual book class is a borrowable book. Wow, it's hard to say. So that allows us to use our interfaces connected together or disconnected if it makes more sense one way or the other. Now let's look at the other items here. We have audiobooks. Well, is an audiobook a book? No, but it is borrowable. We also have this extra runtime in minutes. So let's create a new class, or a new interface, sorry. We're going to call this we have two options here. We can go right away for the simple one, or we can go to the a couple extra steps, but more flexible in the future. I want to go for the more flexible in the future. I'm going to say audiobook. And an audiobook inherits from library. Actually, it implements. So what does a audiobook have? Well, it has a runtime in minutes. That's specific to an audiobook. And let's check anything else out. It does not have pages. Let's get rid of that. We do have the borrow information. We'll go ahead and change this to an iBorrowable in a minute. But I think that's it for iAudiobook. But notice I didn't inherit from iBorrowable. And the reason why is because there may be audiobooks that we cannot borrow. So therefore, now I'll create a new interface called iBorrowable audiobook. And this again will just be a combination of iAudiobook and iBorrowable. An iAudiobook also pulls from iLibrary item. So now we can take this interface, go back to our audiobook, and instead of iLibrary item, it's actually iBorrowable audiobook. Everything still applies. The interface covers all of our different data points here, and it makes sense. Okay, we've combined things in a way that allows us to have that open-close principle. Remember that? We're not going to come in here and modify audiobooks down the road. That way, since we thought it through, if down the road we say, oops, we have a reference audiobook, has to stay at the library, we can't check it out, but it is part of our inventory. No problem. Instead of implementing this interface, we'll implement just the iAudiobook interface. Doesn't have any of the borrow information. It just has the stuff about an audiobook. And again, that sets us up for success down the road. Let's create another interface. Now we're going to clean this up in a minute, so don't worry that we're kind of making huge, big chunks of files. We're going to create let's create iMovie class. Now, here's one of those times when I could think far down the road and say, maybe I want to change this, and maybe I don't. And so right now I'm thinking if I do or if I don't, I could do an iDVD class, and I think I probably will, but here's the deal. If I say iMovie, it's not the end of the world, because whether it's on DVD, Blu-ray, or VHS, it's almost dead. Hopefully it is dead. But all these other types, it's still a movie. But I'd have to have some way of indicating what type of medium it is. Because if you don't have a Blu-ray player, there's no point in borrowing a Blu-ray. And so that's where like an enum would come in, but then we're always changing the enum down the road to say, oh, we added a new type of disc, whatever it is. Maybe it's a digital movie instead. So that's again violating the open-close principle where we're modifying that enum all the time. So it probably makes more sense to do an iDVD class. That way, we can add another class called iBlu-ray or iDigital. So let's make this public. And next, let's go ahead and find out. Let's find out what a DVD is different. What's different about a DVD? So let's start with has no author or pages. So let's get rid of those. It does have a list of actors, and also there's this runtime in minutes. Now, those of you who have sharp eyes have noticed I have seemingly violated the SRP principle. I'm sorry, the dry principle. Don't repeat yourself. And how have I violated that? Well, I have this int runtime minutes in the iDVD class, and I have int runtime minutes in my audiobook interface. So why wouldn't I join those two or have some kind of inheritance going on or implementation? And the reason I wouldn't is because an audiobook and a DVD have nothing in common. Technically, yes, they both have runtimes. They're two different things. It's really trying to compare apples and oranges by saying they both have an outer skin. Yeah, they do. That doesn't mean they're anything alike. So just be careful that you don't just look at a property name and say, oh, that means there's a relationship between audiobooks and DVDs. There's not. So this does not violate dry. Now, you may find a way to create an interface that would be like items that have runtime and put the int runtime in it and then inherit, like iDVD inherits from items that have runtime or implements that. Yeah, you can do that. Unless it really makes sense, it's probably better to just separate those two out and have a copy. Because again, they're two different things. So that's just, one of those words of wisdom. Don't just get caught up in they look the same, therefore they're the same. Okay, so you have iDVD, which has a list of actors and runtime minutes. So with these two things being created, we could just, again, have it come from the iBorrowable, but we're not going to. We're going to come from the iLibrary item. And then we'll create a new interface called iBorrowable DVD. Make it public. Comes from iDVD and iBorrowable. Now I can take this interface. We can apply it to the DVD class. Everything checks out, or it should. Let's find out why it doesn't. Now we don't want to rename iLibrary item. It is saying we do have to implement the interface. Let's find out why, because it looks like we should have I see why. Instead of copying, it looks like I cut. So in here, I have these two properties. They should be on the DVD. They're not. I have to make them public. There we go. And now we correctly implement the iBorrowable DVD. Okay. So one of the questions that may come up in your mind is this interface here looks squirrely. we don't have any types of properties or methods in here. It just is a combination of two different interfaces. So why is it that we couldn't put those two interfaces directly on DVD? Which is a great question. And the reason why is we could, first of all, that would work. And it would seemingly function no differently. But if we have this iBorrowable DVD interface, we can reference this and have access to all these properties and methods without having any kind of casting issue. So we can just say, and let's actually go do this. Let's come over here. We'll add a reference to our project, our demo library. And if I come over here and I say that I have a iBorrowable DVD, and we'll call it just DVD, equals new DVD. Okay, so I'm using the interface as the variable type, not the actual implementation. So the interface will limit you to only what is in the contract, that interface. So let's look at what DVD has access to. Actors, borrow date, borrower, check-in, check-out duration and days, our get due date, our get type, well, we always have that, library item, runtime minutes, title. So it has access to everything we need in one interface. Now, if I change this, instead of this one interface, I came over here and changed it to these two. It still works, but over here, I'd have to say maybe iBorrowable, which that'll work. But now let's look at my list. I have borrow date and borrower, cool. Check in, check out, great. Check out duration and days, get due date, and that's it. So where is my runtime minutes? Where's my title? Where's all that information? Well, that's not in the interface. I have to come over and give me an iDVD, which now we have our actors, we have our library ID, runtime minutes, and title. But where's all the borrowing information? Well, I don't have it. So the only way to get all that information is to then cast it to the actual implementation type, which is a type DVD. Not really what we want to do. So instead, by creating that combination interface, I can come over here and I use the iBorrowable DVD, and now I have access to everything that I want. This will come into play a little more when we are working on the next part of Solid, the D, and we start using interfaces to bring in information instead of having a direct dependency on newing up a specific type. And so we'll get into that more, but this right here is a very valuable concept because we can combine those two and then have access to both interface worth of information into one kind of a super interface. Which originally we had one super interface with our iLibrary item. But that wasn't good because that interface then didn't work with all of our different types. So instead you broke it apart into little pieces, but then combined those pieces up into larger interfaces that worked for a specific area, but then were modular enough to take pieces out and use it for a different area. So we're using some of the same interfaces for the book and the DVD and the audiobook because they're all borrowable. And so they're all coming from that one borrowable interface. So that modularness of the interface, instead of having that one monolithic one, allows it to be more flexible. It allows us to not violate the open-close principle. It allows us to, again, still be dry, that don't repeat yourself. And it allows it to be more future-proof. Now, as you can see, this does make for quite a few more files, which sometimes people get a little freaked out about the idea of having lots of files. Me, not so much. And the reason why is because folders are free. So create as many folders as you want to make things work the way that you understand them best. So for example, I think what I would probably do, this is kind of a rough cut it, and I might change it as we go, but I might create a book folder and then move the book, maybe in the reference book. They're really similar, but they're not the same. Then the interface for iBorrowable and also the iBook. And then I create another folder. And again, this is a rough cut. You might want to change it if you want, but I create audiobook. And I drag in audiobook, iAudiobook, and iBorrowable audiobook. Then I create another one. In this case, I might create a movie folder because you might want to put Blu-ray in here as well. But let's just create DVD to make it clear for now. Again, you can change it down the road. So iBorrowable DVD and iDVD. Now I'm still left with a couple of interfaces that don't really apply to any of these three folders. So what I could do is I could create another folder, or I could leave them at the root. I think what I'd probably do is create general interface folder, and then just drag these into it. So now your project looks a whole lot cleaner. If you want to do anything in the book, well, there you go. Now you could say, again, folders are free, so if you want to, you could, under book, right-click and say, maybe interfaces. And drag the interfaces in here, and then have another one for implementations, or leave those at the root of book. I'm not as big a fan of that because it separates out the interface from the implementation. I kind of like to keep them together. So book and iBook and iBorrowable and the reference book. But it's up to you. Again, it's how you decide to organize this isn't really that important. Now, again, the one thing to remember is if you now create something in this folder, it will no longer have the namespace of just demo library. It will be demolibrary.book, which could cause some issues of not having a using statement or making sure you have to have one of those in all the different places. Just know you can take that namespace and change it to whatever you want, and it won't hurt anything. It might just mean adding a namespace if it's not already there. So that's just something to think through, is your organization process. I might actually have these folders one level deeper if this is a truly a library, a book library application, because I might have something for reference materials or consumables or whatever I want to call it, the things that we actually lend out of the library, because there's so much more to the application than just lending. There's the collection of fees, and there's the user information, and there's the inventory management, and all that other stuff that goes on besides just the items in the inventory. So that's it. That's all there is to the interface segregation principle. It's the idea that we don't have one monolithic interface that doesn't really apply to everything that implements it. Instead, what we do is we break that interface into pieces that we can then put together again in a more modular way. Think of it like your car. If your car was just one piece, whenever it broke, the whole car breaks. But if it's just the door handle that breaks, you can take the door handle out and replace it with a new one. That's more what we're talking about with this modular approach to interfaces. The idea that it's not just one large thing that if we have to make a change, it affects everybody, but instead it's this modular thing we can put together in different ways so that even when something new comes along, it's just taking our current existing chunks, putting them together in a new way, and there you go. For example, if I was going to add a new class, and let's just do that right here. I should create a new folder for it. You know what? Digital movie. Why not? So let's create a class. We'll call it the digital movie class. And to start with, let's look at the DVD class itself. I'm going to grab all this stuff. I'm going to paste it in here, because I don't want to have to implement the interface a whole bunch of different ways. But really, I could do that. Now, it's a digital movie. I don't necessarily want to do that. I might want to create an interface for the iDigital movie and then create the iBorrowable digital movie. But really, since it's digital, there's not a whole lot of changes. So maybe I do that, which does beg the case, maybe we should have called this movie instead of DVD. But you see the power here of, I'm done. I created a new class. It's for digital movies. And the interface is good to go. We're all set here. I'm set. Or I could follow the same pattern and create my own interfaces and use the iLibrary item and use the iBorrowable, but then create my own list of string actors and runtime minutes, because maybe I want something else there as well. So there's options here I can do, and you're not going to get it perfect the first time. Now, according to, again, the open-close principle, you don't change those things which are already in place. That's true. But that's the difference between an application in production versus an application in development. The open-close principle doesn't apply in the same way for a project in development. You can modify all the different classes you want, but what you're trying to do is set them up then so that when you go into production, they don't have to then change again. So you could tweak this, modify this as you're building it and say, just not right. What it comes down to is the better you plan, the better your application is set up for success. And so keeping these solid principles in mind, when you plan out your application, plan out your interface design and say, I know we're going to have DVDs and Blu-rays and maybe some stuff like digital movies in the future, but we want to call them all movies and just have 3 different implementations, one for digital movie, one for DVD, one for Blu-ray. That's how we tell them apart instead of an enum. You can do that. You can also say, nope, we want to have an interface for each of the different types, because who knows if digital movies have something different about them than Blu-rays do. So that's all up to you. The more you do in the design process, the less you change in development, which makes your life a whole lot easier. And then the better you design and develop your application, the less you're going to violate OCP, the open-close principle, and also the ISP. So that's it for the ISP, or the interface segregation principle. It's just breaking those down into little pieces. If you have any questions, post them down below, and I will try and get back to you with an answer as soon as possible. Also, don't forget that this source code will be on my blog. There's a link down in the description below that will send you right to my blog. And if you like it, I appreciate it if you let me know by hitting that like button, as well as let me know in the comments. All right, thank you very much for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey.